Tory tax rows have electrified Westminster, but will anyone in the real world care? Well, one sign a political story matters is if it breaks out into broader popular culture. So I think the Tories might be concerned about this exchange on ITV's This Morning.
He has suggested during this speech, which he gave in Morecambe in Lancashire, that only idiots, to quote his word, wouldn't understand why he can't cut taxes. Now, this is particularly relevant at the moment. So we have Sunak's wife, who claimed, because you have to actively do this, a non-dom status. You have to apply to HMRC to pay a flat fee of £30,000 a year.
Yeah.
It is estimated, when this was discovered by journalists last year, she said, oh, right, I won't do that again, that she would have paid up to £20 million in tax,
Wow.
which has not, no one has said, oh, sorry about that, we'll now pay it, right? That's the first thing. And at the moment, as you know, front pages all the time, Nadeem Sahawi. So Nadeem Zahawi, he set up YouGov, he co-founded it, didn't take shares, he put it into a trust, and therefore it is estimated that he avoided £3.7 million in tax. Now, a friend of mine who's a tax lawyer had gone on to this about 8 months ago. Dan Needle, his name is, he's wonderful, and he went on to it about 8 months ago. Zahawi's lawyers then wrote to Dan to say, stop saying this stuff. Dan, as a lawyer, then reported them to the Solicitors Regulatory Authority because they were threatening he shouldn't say anything about it. And lo and behold, you now see the headlines where he has actively gone to HMRC and offered to pay this money.
That seatbelt chat escalated quite a
That
bit.
did, didn't it?
Well,
Obviously,
they're not here to...
They're not here to defend themselves, but they're all corrupt!
Well, yes.
That was so good. I love Alison Hammond. Clearly, what happened there is, on the earpieces, the producers were saying, "Look, there's no one here to respond. Normally, if you're putting forward an allegation, you need to have, this is the official position from Nadeem Zahawi or the government or whatever." In response, they try and intervene, but Alison Hammond doesn't seem to be able to control herself and shouts out what she clearly believes, which is they're all corrupt. Ash, Carol Vorderman is on the case. She is on top of this story. She's been tweeting about it a lot. And I mean, that, I think, instinctive reaction from Alison Hammond hosting ITV's This Morning, is that going to have the Tories worried?
Yeah, it's absolutely going to have the Tories worried. And I'm going to tell you why. First is that Rishi Sunak is too weak to be able to deal with this effectively. His support within the Conservative Party is very, very shaky indeed, because he was the losing candidate. He wasn't the guy who the majority of the party wanted to get behind. You still have Conservative benches which are deeply divided. You've got the kind of technocrats who've rallied around Sunak. You've still got a bunch of libertarian headbangers who think that the problem is that real Trussism was never truly tried anywhere. And you've got a bunch of people who are wondering if there's a path back for Boris Johnson. So this isn't a stable basis for Rishi Sunak to either, properly reprimand Zahawi and force him to step down, or count on the support of enough of his party so he can ride out this kind of scandal. So that's the first reason why it's worrying for the Conservative Party. The second, and I think the most important one, is you take a step back and you look at the overall political climate. Everyone knows that the Tories have fucked it. They drove the economy into a wall by trying to push through wholly unwanted and uncosted tax cuts, which would have disproportionately benefited the rich. And now pretty much everybody who isn't very well off, I'm talking owning your home outright well off, is suffering because of it. It's either interest rates on their mortgage, interest rates on a landlord's mortgage being pushed on in the form of rent, and the increased cost of living absolutely everywhere. So against that backdrop, when you've got what's essentially been, standard operating practice for the Conservative Party for the past 10 years, which is use your position to yourself, use the fact that you are wealthy and you are powerful to insulate yourself from the kinds of accountability that regular, ordinary folk are subject to. Using the VIP lane in order to dole out contracts to your friends, and in some cases, such as, with the likes of Michelle Mone, even to yourself. Within this context of a cost of living crisis where everybody is seeing their living standards fall, the political cover is no longer there in the same way. So you've got a structurally weak prime minister at the helm of a, simmeringly mutinous party. You've got the fact that the press and the public have turned against the Conservative Party in huge numbers. I mean, you're talking about a 20-point polling gap between the Tories and Labour. Now you've got a story like this, which seems to sum the whole thing up. It's us lot, the law protects but does not bind, and you lot, the law binds but does not protect. And that is a feeling of unfairness which crosses party lines. It doesn't matter whether you're a Labour voter or a Tory voter. You look at that and you go, this stinks to high heaven.
There's 3 scandals at the moment. There's Rishi Sunak's seatbelt, which I don't think is a particularly big issue. Boris Johnson and the BBC, which is pretty outrageous, but I think refers essentially to a previous prime minister. And then there's this Zahawi one. And when these all erupted, I was a little bit worried in a way, because one thing I think has been relatively healthy about political discourse recently, it's been forced into this position by very, very dire, terrible situations. But we're actually talking about public services. We're actually talking about policy. People seem to be recognizing that austerity did destroy the health service and really degrade society as a whole. So it feels like we're talking about the stuff that matters. And I was a bit worried all these scandals come up. Are we just going to get to this who broke what rules? The moment I hear, Chris Mason, the BBC political editor, this is not his fault, but the moment I hear him sort of say, this has been referred to the independent ethics advisor, I feel like, oh my God. Like the moment I hear that phrase, I almost switch off. But I think that this does matter, and it matters because I think it's about tax, right? So what I'm saying here, the big story, and it should remain the big story, is that people are having to wait 2 hours for an ambulance when they've had a heart attack or a stroke, right? That is the biggest story in Britain right now. But then you take a step back. Why are we in that position? Oh, it's because the government hasn't spent enough money on the NHS. Why haven't they spent enough money on the NHS? Well, one, because they're reluctant to borrow to invest, which itself is a little bit economically disastrous, a bit self-defeating. But just as important, perhaps more important, they're not willing to raise taxes on the super rich. If we raise taxes on the super rich, we'd have more than enough to pay everyone properly in the NHS. We wouldn't have to be threatening nurses and saying, well, if we pay you more, that's going to have to come from elsewhere in the healthcare budget. We wouldn't be making ambulance drivers and teachers compete for a small pot of money. No, we'd be taxing the people who've got, by the way, much, much richer over the course of the pandemic and over the last year. I think asset wealth went up by £1 trillion last year. So there's a lot of money we could be taxing so that we don't have a society in which public services are completely collapsing. And the fact that we have, as Prime Minister, someone whose wife was a non-dom, remember that family is worth about £700 million. The fact that we have as chair of the governing party, someone who accidentally forgot to pay £3 million of tax, which just so happened to be due on a bunch of money which he'd placed in a tax haven. This shows you what side they're on, and also why the big block to rescuing our public services is that the people in charge don't think paying tax is important. They haven't been particularly willing to cough up themselves, even though they are in the top 0.1%. And then we can't really expect them to raise taxes on the rest of the super rich because they're not willing to pay it themselves. I mean, do you think that's the real story here, Ash? And do you think this is what, I suppose, Labour or the left or whoever need to keep bringing this back to? Let's not let this get bogged down in the whole, what does the ethics advisor say? This is a question about rich people not being willing to pay tax at the same time that we are seeing an absolute crisis in the NHS.
I both agree with you and disagree with you a bit, Michael. So I agree with you that getting stuck in the weeds about the independent ethics advisor, that's not something which has cut through. And the reason why it doesn't have cut through is because it's, number one, incredibly boring, and number two, it has zero impact on anybody's quality of life. All right. absolutely nobody's. However, when you look back through Conservative Party history and you cast your mind back to the halcyon days of the 1990s, can you name one John Major sleaze story, an individual sleaze story from the John Major era?
I was quite a young child. No, I can't name one. Wasn't there... Did we know about Edwina Curry at the time, or was that later on? I mean, is that even a scandal? Was that just a bog standard affair? I don't know.
Later on, I mean, like one of the ones I can think of, I think, is Cash for Questions. But
yeah, that was
look, the individual John Major sleaze stories, it doesn't matter. And it didn't really matter at the time. What matters is when you've got the accumulation of sleaze stories, which you do have with the Conservative Party. You've got VIP Lane, you've got Michelle Mone, you've got contracts being handed out willy-nilly during the pandemic, you've got Nadeem Zahawi, and you've now got this Boris Johnson thing. That adds up to a kind of miasma of corruption, the sense of they're all piggies in the trough. And even if you can't nail down on election day which of the stories it was that really got your goat, the overall feel, the vibe, the mood music, I think, is something which is incredibly important and impactful. And one of the things that I'm going to say, and this is a really big difference between the UK and the US, is that we have huge poll movement in this country compared to the US. In the US, presidential elections can be decided on the basis of 0.9%. You know, the kind of poll movement that you see is, you know, if there's a, you know, poll swing of, you know, 2 or 3%, you're like, wow, what the fuck? That's massive. We're looking at a 20-point gap between Labour and the Conservatives. That is absolutely ginormous. Now, of course, you can expect that to narrow when it comes to a general election, but that is an absolutely huge swing. And having these stories about the Conservative Party is not going to hurt Labour's chances at all. It adds up to that mood music. Now, where I think you're coming from, and this is where I agree with you as well, on what basis do people make their political decisions? Ultimately, I think one of the reasons why there is a avenue back for Boris Johnson is because he was forced to quit on a matter that didn't impact the lives of ordinary people in this country. It was over a Westminster sex pest scandal. And obviously what Christopher Pincher was alleged to have done was absolutely awful and indefensible, but it's not something like presiding over disastrous economic policy. Now, of course, austerity, the handling of the pandemic, those were all things that were disastrous. But that wasn't what forced him out of power. So I think that that's why there's, you know, potentially a route back. But all of these stories that are being laid on Rishi Sunak's door, from Nadeem Zahawi, which is on the Westminster end, to the continuing cost of living crisis, which is much more on the this affects the public end, he's got really not very much room to maneuver at all. He's going to find it really difficult. But like I was saying, the basis on which things happen, I think, is important. What you want is for people to be raising the hue and cry of austerity and what's happening to public services. The fact that the workers' share of wealth has declined over the last few decades, whereas the ability of oligarchs and corporations to extract profit and stash it in tax havens, it's easier than ever before. We want people to be voting on that basis, and you want that to be the level of political consciousness, not because that forces the Conservatives' hand, but because that forces Labour's hand. So I agree with you that what you want is for that wider economic story to be the basis on which people make their political decisions. But ultimately, stories like this, they're not going to hurt Labour. They're not going to hurt Labour one bit.